Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs chapter 9 this evening. As we've been walking through the last couple of chapters of Proverbs that have been talking about wisdom, has been through the analogy of Solomon speaking to his son with the idea of wisdom being the form of a woman and also ignorance being the form of a woman, and then kind of this deciding which way will you go, which will you choose, kind of the setting up of things. And tonight is kind of the culmination of that, and you'll see that he opens with the picture of woman of wisdom and then woman of folly, these two opposing women, and then almost laying out the foundation, giving direction to his son on which way he should choose to follow wisdom. Now, one of the things I think is important for us is we talk often in here about God's sovereignty, about God's authority, about how he's in control of all things. Nothing happens outside of his allowance, and all of those things are very, very true and vital for us to understand. But we also need to understand that there is still responsibility of man in choosing. And so it is not as if God has placed all things in position and then man has no responsibility to believe or to choose or to follow. Man is responsible for those things. God gives us the freedom to make the decisions through that discernment, and then gives us the information through his wisdom to see what is biblical truth, what is worldly truth, and then allows man to make the decision of what they will follow. We see clearly in the book of Joshua, choose this day whom you will serve. There is a picture that while God is sovereign and in control, he still allows man to have freedom. Some people struggle with that concept, one way or the other. They'll struggle on one end and say, well, if God is sovereign, then man really doesn't have choice. And then on the other end, say, well, if man has choice, then God really can't be sovereign, and I will submit to you this morning's sermon. And that is that we don't have the capacity to understand how he can be both, but he is. And the reason we know that he is because his word gives us both. It tells us that he is sovereign, and it tells us that we have responsibility to choose and to follow. And so both are harmoniously working together. There is no difficulty in that. It is just submission that we can't understand, but simply follow what he has given to us, and that is to choose wisdom over folly, knowing that he is in control of all of those things. So with that kind of as the background, because I don't want there to be any underlying, is he trying to get something across? I want to be clear in what I'm stating on those things. This is what Proverbs tells us. We see the first setup, the idea of the woman of wisdom. So the first 6 verses kind of speak to this. So we'll read this. And again, this is poetry, and so it doesn't read as clearly as some of the instructional letters of Paul or the Gospels. It's a poetic Old Testament writing, so there is some discerning through it, and it's subjective, or that's not the right word, not subjective, but it's representative wording and how it does things. So wisdom, verse 1 of chapter 9, wisdom has built her house, and she has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Now, let's just pause there for a moment. Again, see the picture that he's painting for wisdom. And I would relate this to, again, this morning's message, wisdom that is from above, godly wisdom, as opposed to worldly wisdom or folly. This woman of wisdom that he is speaking of, which is another representation of God's wisdom, says she has built her house and has hewn or constructed her 7 pillars. Does that have any significance whatsoever? Perfection, right? The 7 is the number of completion, the number of perfection. The temple that was built, Solomon's temple, the front of that, 7 pillars, the completion, 7 is that number. And so he is saying this wisdom in its house, what is kept and housed in wisdom, is complete. It is not lacking. That is the picture that he is making by this. So we almost see him making the distinction that wisdom and the house of wisdom is the temple. It is God's presence. God's wisdom is perfect wisdom. Then it goes on. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine, and she has set her table. This is a picture of this feast that is utilized throughout all of Scripture. The only person who had more feasts than Baptists were the nation of Israel, okay? They were constantly having feasts and gatherings and meals. It's how they honored each other. It's how they worshiped God. And so there was always this idea of these grand feasts that would take place. And this was not a simple feast. This was one that was served with meat and wine. This was an extensive feast. This is also a picture, if you take these things and project to the New Testament, these ideas of the flesh, the slaughtering of the beast, and the wine being served to those as an understanding of taking in from this meal, from this feast in the midst of wisdom. And we see later, maybe this correlates a little bit. I'm not saying it does perfectly, but maybe we see the same correlation where Jesus talks about, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. The same correlation that those who will take their feast from who Christ is find their wisdom in that. He has the fullness, the culmination. God in Christ sent full wisdom to earth for the first time in its completion in man, and that was Christ himself. So this picture of this table being laid out, spread out, this feast that is available. So in the perfect housing of God's wisdom, and this feast that is being laid out, then we see a picture where it says she has sent out her young women to call to the highest places in town. Again, we see this picture in the New Testament as well, where Jesus is using the analogy of this parable of a feast, and they send out the servants to call out those in the town to come and join the feast. Some come and some choose not to come. This is the same picture that we see here. It's also the same understanding that we talked about God being sovereign, but giving man the understanding and the decision. God gives and has laid out the foundations. The invitation has been made to receive his understanding, his wisdom, his calling. That word has been gone out into the streets by his people, by believers, by us who go and share the truth of the gospel with the world, by his word that he has left for us to know him by. The invitation has been sent out to join in the feast in knowing Christ, and some will accept and some will deny the invitation. This is the picture that we see in this. The cry that goes out from these servants who go out into the street is this: whoever is simple, let him turn in here. Now again, we make joke about this, but this idea of simple, it means whoever is without this arrogance of wisdom about them. Whoever is common man is what this means, which fits well for the majority of people. So whoever is simple, whoever is needing understanding, let him turn in here. Now, that can be to some might find that offensive and say, well, if you're saying this is for simple-minded people, then you're saying that's why Scripture speaks, is because people who don't know any better have to believe in something. But I want to present to you that I don't think that it's a slander to say those who are simple come to me, but to say those who need wisdom come here to gain your wisdom. And it takes someone who is truly wise to seek wisdom. Someone who thinks that they have wisdom and chases something that is not wisdom is who I would call simple or ignorant in that case. And so it is saying whoever is lacking in wisdom, whoever is in need of wisdom, come to here. Come to this feast where you will receive this wisdom. To him, it goes on, who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread, drink of my wine, I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight. The calling, the invitation is there. The invitation is there to come, to eat, to drink, to gain insight. But the calling comes with an invitation that speaks to leaving something behind. It's not just an invitation to say, hey, this is a portion. You can keep being who you are, doing what you're doing, and add this to and come to this feast. But it's saying to those of you who are these people who want to come and feast and gain of the wisdom of God, if we want to gain in wisdom, look at verse 6, leave behind your simple ways. I don't know a clearer way to explain it than the way this says, and that is simply, we can't gain godly wisdom until we lay down the earthly wisdom. when we try to take God's wisdom, again, and cram it into our worldly, fleshly wisdom of understanding, it will never make sense. And so we have to come to a point where we lay down what we think to be right, what we think to be good, what we think to be wisdom, and say, this is not wisdom, this is the simple way. I want God's way. And so we leave behind and take the invitation to go into His feast where we eat and drink and we find our nutrients, we find our refreshment, we find our satisfaction in the wisdom of God through feasting in His wisdom, leaving behind the other. I think it's so important that it says, leave it behind and live in the way of insight. We live and walk. It changes. When we take in of that feast of wisdom that comes from God, it changes how we live, it changes how we walk, and we now walk in the way of insight because we have left behind the old way and brought in the new. So this is the invitation and the promise of what can come if we partake in the wisdom and feasting on the wisdom of God in this picture. He goes on in verse 7 through 12 to kind of give some instruction to his son as he is presenting this picture of this feast with the wise. And he goes on to tell him that this won't be simple. Whoever corrects the scoffer gets himself abuse. Whoever reproofs a wicked man incurs injury. This is a true understanding that we, trying in its purpose to correct scoffers or to correct the wicked, there will be pushback. There will be pushback when we try to correct those or show truth to those or reprove those who are wicked or are scoffers. There will be rebuttal, there will be abuse, there will be the pushback from those things. It will be difficult. He goes on in verse 8 and he says, do not reprove a scoffer or he will hate you. If we try to offer instruction to those who are unwilling to hear the truth, their response will be hatred to us because our wisdom that comes from God, God's wisdom, is in direct opposition to worldly wisdom. And it will, and I'm sure you've encountered this or seen, that it will incur hatred from the opposition, at times violence, injury, abuse from the opposition because of their hatred towards that truth. He goes on to say, reprove a wise man and he will love you. So he pits these against themselves. If you offer reproof to someone and their response is hatred and anger or abuse back towards you, it shows you that they have not received or are not willing to receive the truth that comes. But if you reproof or give correction to a wise man, he will see it and love you for it. He will fall into that understanding because he recognizes the same as we do, by the grace of God, the wisdom that is in that instruction. Verse 9, he continues, give instruction to a wise man, and he will still be wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. This is an encouragement to us all as believers. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will still be wiser. This is a little bit of what I talked about this morning when I said just because his ways are beyond our ways doesn't mean we stop pursuing his ways. We want to grow in wisdom. We want to continue to become wiser and wiser. But one of the greatest points of wisdom is recognizing that we will not have a completion of wisdom. And once we reach that point, then we can have wisdom about the things beneath that because we're not longing for the things that we can't achieve or understand. It gives us clarity. And so there is wisdom in a wise man continuing to learn, and a righteous man who can continue to increase in learning. We never cease increasing in our learning, in our wisdom, or in our righteousness, and how we grow until we are in the presence of the Lord. Verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Again, this is, I think, the third or fourth time already through 9 chapters in the book of Proverbs where this phrasing of some form, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, is used. And again, it's the picture, not of this fear as in God is the boogeyman fear, and it's not simply a fear that is a reverence alone. It is a fear that sits on us because it is the weight of recognizing the majesty of the God that we serve and that feeling that you get. We've talked about this a lot in here. When you stand at the base of an ocean and look out at its vastness, There's something that's overwhelming about that. There's people who have legitimate phobias about getting stuck out in the middle of the ocean because the vastness of that causes fear, because it's so massive, it strikes fear into us. That same fear of something that is so beyond us, I believe, is a lot of what this is talking about. And a right fear of the ocean says, maybe I shouldn't jump out of the boat in the middle and think I can get out, right? The same type of fear is the wisdom that says, if God says this is the way and I can't completely understand it, I'm going to follow what he says because I have a fear, a healthy, reverent fear of something that is greater than me. That's the first step. It's the beginning of wisdom. So before we can progress in it, we first must recognize that it's beyond us and that we are in need of that understanding before we can continue. And then he says, and knowledge of the Holy One is insight. So recognizing God as holy is the first portion of insight. In verse 11, for by me your days will be multiplied and your years will be added to your life. That me there is again speaking of God's wisdom. Your days will be multiplied and years added to your life, living according to the wisdom of God. If you are wise for yourself. And if you scoff, you will bear it alone. So the wisdom comes from God and benefits us as those who grow in wisdom for ourselves and for our lives. But if we turn from it, we bear that turning alone. This is man's choice, man's decision, whether to receive wisdom or whether to scoff at it. He throws this in the middle of the countering of these two women, one of folly, one of wisdom, to help his son to realize that the choice is his to make and how he will live. Then he gives the woman of folly here in the last couple of verses, starting in 13. The woman of folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house, and she takes a seat in high places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their path. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, and that her guests go down to the depths of Sheol. Sheol, again, being the place of death for the Jewish people, place of the dead. So in this picture, there's a couple of things that I want us to pull out so that we can avoid the temptation, the seduction of the woman of folly or of false wisdom. The first thing I want us to recognize is that the calling from the woman of wisdom in verse 4 is, whoever is simple, let him turn in here. The calling of the woman of folly in verse 16 is, whoever is simple, let him turn in here. What we need to recognize is that what we call worldly wisdom is so close at times to what looks like godly wisdom that it causes the discretion in us to fail. Well, this sounds really good. It sounds just like this over here. So maybe this is the way. Maybe this is where we should go. But there's subtle differences. There's subtleties in the difference, but it sounds very close. It seems good. That's why it says that she is loud in her cry. She is crying out loudly to gain the attention, and then she is seductive. The idea that folly and worldly wisdom is a seductive thing. It seduces the hearer into believing that it is what they are searching for. It's the seduction that this is the wisdom I've been searching for. Here it is before me, and that path is chosen. It goes on to say she sits at the door of her house and takes a seat in the highest places of town, which is very similar to where it says that there are women sent out into the town to cry out. But the temple itself, this house that was built in high places, but we see that people are sent out into the field to gather those, while the other sits back and hopes that people in its passing by will be seduced and deceived and brought into this calling. And then it says, she calls out to those who pass by, who were going straight on their way. The attack of the enemy in this seductive idea, this woman of folly, is to catch people who were going straight on their way and to deter their path, to sidetrack, to derail their path into this path of seduction, of false wisdom. She cries out, he who is simple, let him turn here. And then she says to those who lack sense these words. Now this again is similar to what is said by the woman of wisdom. She says, "Come eat my bread, drink of the wine that I have mixed." This one says, "Come and eat and drink," but look at how it's worded. Stolen water is sweet. It's not wine at this point, not even mixed wine with water, which is what's referenced earlier. This is simply stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. Now, this on the outset just seems odd, that something stolen would be sweet, or that something done in secret would be pleasant. But what's happening by the seduction, I believe, is the temptation of the flesh that we can succumb to. Sometimes the things that seem forbidden are the things that we want the most. Inside of the flesh, when we're told you can't have it, you want it more. We've all had children, raised children, been around children to some point, and if you tell them these are the things you can do, but don't do this, man, what do they want to do? The one thing you said don't do. And it's frustrating, but it's the nature of man. You ready for it? We're going to do it. We do it every week, right? In the garden, there was one thing that was said not to touch. And what was the seduction? Well, this is something you can have. The seduction was this forbidden fruit is the sweeter fruit. The things that you're told you can't have, sometimes the flesh just has a desire to want those things because of the curiosity or the desire of why can't we have them. That's the temptation of worldly wisdom, the seduction of worldly wisdom. One is saying, "Come and eat my bread and drink my wine. I have the meal laid out for you." Another is saying, "Hey, listen, I've got bread and wine too, but it's the kind you're not supposed to have, but I'll give it to you." And the flesh fails in that and saying, "Ooh, that sounds tempting. That sounds nice. That sounds like something that would draw us." The temptation of evil, the seduction of evil, is sometimes into the things that we think we can obtain, and then all of a sudden we give access to, and we stumble and fall moving into it. But verse 18 speaks the truth of these things that are forbidden from God for us. They are forbidden for a purpose, because their pathway leads to death. The man that is being tempted in this, when this seduction comes and says, "Come and eat of this secret bread and this stolen water. Come and have these things." It sounds pleasant, sounds good, but he does not know that the dead are there. He doesn't know that those who eat of that bread and drink of that stolen water lead to death, and that the guests of this meal are in the depths of Sheol. The guest of this meal that follows worldly wisdom as the ultimate wisdom has one end, and that is the place of the dead. Where the other says in verse 6, "Leave your simple ways and live." There is a wisdom that leads to life, and there is a wisdom that leads to death. And it is presented poetically in this as a woman of wisdom and a woman of folly. One leads to life, one leads to death. And the interesting thing about choosing the one with life is that if you want to choose the wisdom that leads to life, you first must die. You have to die to self to receive the new life. You can't continue living in your life and then receive this new life. You must die to the old. Leave your old ways. Die to the old ways, and then you can live in insight. Or the choice is to continue to live, fall to the seduction, and then if you choose to live now, your eternity is in death, as opposed to dying now and your eternity being in life. It's the complete opposite. There is no mingling, there is no marrying of the two wisdoms. There is a wisdom that comes from above and one that is here on the earth. One leads to life, one leads to death. And we are given, just like this son, the opportunity to evaluate these truths and then decide which wisdom we choose to follow. But if we choose to follow the wisdom of the Lord, let me encourage you to say, it's fully following. It's not fully understanding, it's fully following. It is not knowing the way of the Lord and He will direct your path. It is trusting in the Lord and He will direct your path. We can trust without full knowledge. And that's where we need to lean into. This is the calling of the Father to the Son in this. It's the calling of our Heavenly Father to us, and it should be the message that we present to the world that there are two ends. One leads to life, one leads to death. Which wisdom will you choose? It's the picture of this, and I think it's a beautifully written and poetically produced portion of the text to help us to see the deceit that comes from the wisdom of the world and the joy that comes, but also the cost that comes in receiving the wisdom that comes from above. Questions, comments about Proverbs 9? All right. Well, let me close this in a word of prayer, and we will be dismissed.